Invaders' Wrath, The Unstoppable Titans, Book 2, written and read by Jerry Hart. Chapter 1. The truth behind the events that transpired on an October night in San Sebastian, Texas, were a mystery to those but a few. For one, there was the SUV that had reportedly been thrown at an alleyway in the heart of downtown. Then there were the explosions that rocked Montleroy Estates condominiums a few blocks away. The body of 19-year-old Daniel Hudson had been found there. There was also the destruction of a 6-level parking garage down the street from the condo. All of this in one night. It was believed all of these events were connected, but it couldn't be proven. But Officer Patrick Fisher tried with all his might to do just that. He stood in front of the hospital morgue, running his fingers through his short brown hair. There were a few grays in there, unfortunately, though he was only 27, waiting for Douglas Hudson, brother of the deceased. The officer had had the unfortunate task of notifying Mr. Hudson that his brother had been found dead in his condo, and that Mr. Hudson would be needed to positively identify the body. A young man was walking slowly toward Officer Fisher now, and at that moment, the young officer had practically identified the body himself, because the man who was walking toward him now looked exactly like the deceased. Doug Hudson, twin brother to Daniel, looked pale and stricken, but his brown hair was slightly longer than Daniel's. "Mr. Hudson?" Patrick extended his hand. "I'm Officer Fisher. I'm sorry that we have to meet under these circumstances." Doug nodded, shook the officer's hand, but said nothing. Instead, he followed him through the morgue. A medical examiner with short gray hair stood by a table. A body lay on that table, covered with a white sheet. "Are you ready?" Patrick asked. Doug nodded. The M.E. lifted the sheet. Doug let out an involuntary grunt, nodded when Patrick asked if he was okay, then turned and vomited on the floor. It took a minute for Doug to recover, but once he did, he looked back to his brother's body. Patrick had neglected to mention how Daniel had died, and Doug could see why. He studied Daniel's upper body. There were 4 deep holes under his collarbone, as if someone had dug fingers in. "Yeah, that's him," Doug said to the officer in a choked voice. Suddenly, Daniel's eyes, which had been closed, shot open. The attendant sighed and closed them. "Sorry," he said. "They keep doing that." Patrick nodded and took Doug aside. "We're investigating your brother's unusual death, and any information you could give us would be helpful." "What kind of information?" Doug asked tentatively. "Your brother's condo suffered a lot of damage due to several explosions. We believe that may have been what killed him." He paused for a moment, then continued. "Was your brother involved in anything that may be considered criminal activity?" Doug stared at him with wide eyes, then said, "You think my brother was a terrorist or something?" "We don't know, but we found a lot of explosives and other questionable things when we searched his place." "Like what?" "Weapons. Guns, crossbows, schematics for... well, we don't know for what. It looks like a robot or something." Doug shook his head. Patrick thanked him and told him he would keep him informed of his investigation into Daniel's death. He then escorted the grieving man out of the morgue. Frank, the M.E., was about to cover up the body when, once again, Daniel's eyes shot open. "Damn it," he said. "Stay closed." Frank angrily shoved Daniel's lids closed, then covered him with the sheet. He walked over to a table and grabbed a clipboard. After a quiet moment, a sound made him spin around and nearly drop the clipboard. Daniel was gone, the sheet draping off of the table. Frank froze in place. He walked slowly to the table and noticed Daniel lying face down on the floor. "Gross," Frank said over and over. He reached down and turned the poor dead boy over. What had happened to this kid? Frank had a theory, but it was too crazy to believe. He suspected that Daniel had died from internal bleeding and head trauma due to being either dropped from a great height or being thrown against the ground from a low height, but at great speed. There was one deep indentation in the boy's right shoulder and 4 just under his collarbone. There were similar marks on his right arm, which had been bound in a cast. The boy had broken his arm before his death. If someone had indeed dropped poor Mr. Hudson off a building, then the cops would soon find him. They had taken fingerprints from the indentions. It was only a matter of time. As Frank angrily reached for the body, Daniel's hand shot up and grabbed his arm. Those dead eyes looked at the M.E. And then good old Frank died of fright. Daniel looked up at the sudden discomfort he felt. Something was terribly wrong, but he couldn't tell what. This was the second time in no telling how long that he had felt this way. It felt as if he were in 2 places at once. That couldn't be, though. He was dead. And now he was in some heavenly place, surrounded by others who had passed on. At that moment, he was sitting on a cloud and looking at a beautiful blue waterfall a few yards in front of him. This was a special place he liked to visit often, but it was being spoiled by that annoying tugging. He stood and ran up the step-like clouds until he reached a big, bright hall made from white marble. There were massive golden columns holding up the ceiling high above. Others wandered around the hall, talking to one another and smiling. Everyone was happy here. Everyone except him. Daniel wished he hadn't died at the hands of Michael, but at least there was someone else here who helped him cope with this situation. And he saw her now. "Alyssa?" he called. Alyssa Turner turned away from a grand staircase at the end of the hall and smiled. Her long brown hair went past her shoulders and almost looked to be glowing. Everyone's hair glowed in this place, but Alyssa's seemed to do so even more. Daniel ran up to her, noticing that he wasn't the least bit winded from the effort. "I'm feeling it again," he told her. "Are you okay?" He nodded. "It just feels like I'm in 2 places at the same time, you know? When that happens, I find it hard to concentrate." Alyssa tapped her chin as she thought. "Maybe it has something to do with your body in the living world." "Do you think something happened to it?" he asked nervously. "I don't know. Maybe we should talk to Owen's mom." They ran up the grand staircase, not knowing exactly where to go. They had only visited Sunita Walters once after they'd joined this wondrous place. Daniel knew it wasn't quite real. It was just a place constructed for meetings by the very first people to lose their human shells in the living world, but it was still beautiful and comforting. Even the clean white clothes everyone wore weren't real. Daniel could change his clothes with a thought if he wanted, but he didn't really care enough. When they reached the top floor, They came to a large golden door at the end of the hall. Alyssa knocked twice, producing a musical sound that echoed behind her and Daniel. Then they waited. A moment later, the grand doors opened. Inside was a very large room. Daniel couldn't believe a room that big could fit inside of a building. Of course, he had to remember this place wasn't quite real, and that anything was possible. The room was empty, however. There were large rectangular windows lining the walls, with dim white light shining in through them. There was no furniture, and the floors were shiny and beautiful. "Where is she?" Alyssa asked. "Maybe we have to call her?" Daniel asked. Alyssa nodded. "Sunita, we need to talk to you," she said into the open room. A moment of silence, but no response. "Please, Sunita," said Daniel. "You said that if we ever needed to talk to you, to come to this room and call for you. Something's wrong and we need your help." Seconds later, a shape began appearing in front of them. It was composed of cyan-colored light, and it quickly formed into a woman in a white dress. She had long brown hair and blue eyes, and though she usually had a smile on her face, she was now frowning. "What's wrong?" she asked. Alyssa shoved Daniel forward. "Something is wrong on Earth, I think," he told Sunita nervously. "I feel weird, and I was thinking that maybe something was happening to my body." Sunita looked thoughtful. "That's possible." "Is there anything we can do?" Alyssa asked. Sunita looked at her. "Once you've left your body, there really is no way to keep an eye on it anymore. You can't return to it." "What if the body wasn't completely dead?" Daniel asked. "Could someone return to it if that was the case?" "Yes," said Sunita. "But that's not the case, is it?" "So there's nothing we can do?" Alyssa sounded angry. Sunita sighed. "I will see what I can do, but I make no promises, okay?" Daniel and Alyssa left the room a moment later, not feeling any better. Daniel trusted his friend's mother, but she'd seemed distracted during the whole conversation. He and Alyssa headed back outside, to the snow-white landscape and blue waterfall. "What are you thinking about?" Alyssa suddenly asked him as he stared at his reflection in the water. "You heard what she said about returning to your body if you're not completely dead." "So? We're completely dead." "I know, but our friends aren't. I'm going to keep an eye on Chris and Owen. If they get in trouble, I want to help them. So they don't end up here, like us." "This place isn't so bad," Alyssa said quietly. "It's not," he agreed. "But we're not supposed to be here. I don't want them coming here until it's their time. Okay?" Daniel heard the seriousness in his voice and tried to smile, but Alyssa wasn't fooled. "Mind if I help?" she asked. "Not at all." They leaned closer to the water and began watching after their friends. All they had to do was clear their minds. Nurse Laura, as everyone called her, strode up to San Sebastian Hospital, uncomfortable by the strange chill in the air. Cold in October was normal, but this cold felt wrong somehow. She pulled her white sweater tight over her scrubs as she walked through the automatic doors of the hospital. The moment she stepped in, she knew something was going on. Doctors were running down hallways, calling out orders. Nurses were running alongside, assisting in any way they could. There were a few injured and waiting patients who looked nervously about themselves. Laura had heard about the parking garage explosion down the street and figured that had something to do with the chaos at the hospital. As she pushed her long brown hair from her eyes, A young man in similar scrubs walked quickly up to her. "It is a madhouse today," he said. "What happened, Tony? You hear about the explosion?" he asked as they walked together down the hall. "Yeah, the parking garage." He nodded. "And Montleroy Estates, which is right down the street from the garage." "Two explosions?" she asked. "Yes and no. There were some small explosions at the condo, and one fatality. A boy. Only a few people were injured at the garage, thank God. That's not the strange thing, though." "What is the strange thing, Tony?" "From what I heard, moments before the explosion, some weird pulse went throughout the city, causing damage to a few buildings surrounding the garage. After that, people started acting weird." "Weird how?" Laura asked, looking at Tony like he was crazy. He was always full of gossip, but she'd never seen him worked up like this. "Like zombies. You remember Old Man Horner? The dementia patient?" "Yes." "Well, the old man actually tried to get up and walk out of here today." "He's lucid?" "Not just lucid, girl. Hostile. He got really violent when we tried to stop him. It took 4 guys just to take him down. We've got him subdued now, but it was like something out of a horror movie." "That doesn't sound too strange," Laura countered. "Well, try this on for size. We had an elderly woman this morning who passed away just as the pulse hit over here." He paused for dramatic effect. Laura hated when he did that. "And?" she prompted. "The old woman was revived a minute later." He nodded, his eyes wide. "She attacked her daughter, who was visiting at the time. She's okay now, and the old lady died a second time." That was weird and scary. "You know what I think?" Tony asked Laura. "I think that weird pulse thing brought that old lady back to life, and I think it called out to Old Man Horner." "Called out?" "Yep. I think it was calling him to wherever it originated. He seemed pretty insistent on leaving here. He almost made it out the front, too. I saw it. He was headed toward downtown." "That doesn't mean anything," said Laura. "You read too many sci-fi novels." He rolled his eyes. "Whatever. Things are settling down now. Around the time I could swear I heard a bunch of tiny bassy thumps. Felt like I was back at the club." He did a little dance before going on. "We had some problems with the younger patients. They got a little antsy. And don't get me started on the babies. One of them actually broke a nurse's finger. Can you believe it?" "How did that happen?" Laura asked. "The nurse just reached out to let the baby grab her finger, because she thought it would be cute. Then snap! That baby was strong, honey." "Too bad I missed all the excitement," Laura said sarcastically. "Are you sure things are settled down?" Tony nodded. "I have to check on Miss Polanski," Laura said as she branched off down another hallway. "I'll catch you later, Tony." After clocking in, Laura made her way to Stephanie Polanski's room. The poor young girl had suffered severe blood loss and was also under the influence of a strange, unidentifiable toxin that put her in a coma. The doctor had managed to get her blood pressure up to safe levels, though this was the girl's second trip to the hospital this week for the same affliction. Just what had happened to Miss Polanski? Her roommate, Becky Simon, had told the doctor a young man claimed someone attacked the poor girl and then escaped just before Miss Simon showed up. That sounded like such an unlikely story to Laura, she had difficulty believing it. If anything, the young man Becky spoke of attacked Stephanie himself. Miss Simon was lucky not to have been attacked as well. But what about the strange puncture wounds on Stephanie's neck? They almost looked like animal bites. Laura assumed the young man was caught up in a vampire craze and went a little too far with Stephanie in fulfilling his dark desires. That didn't explain the toxin, however. Whatever it was, it managed to do odd things to Stephanie's brain patterns. The doctor said he'd never seen anything like it before, and he did not know how to treat it. The poor girl's parents had visited their daughter just yesterday, and were distraught over how they had treated her when she was younger. They had blamed themselves for Stephanie's condition, saying if they hadn't thrown her out years ago, she wouldn't have hooked up with the wrong people. They thought it was merely drugs that affected their daughter. The guilty minds of negligent parents. Laura walked up to Stephanie's bed and looked directly at the machines displaying the patient's vital signs. Then Laura looked at her chart at the foot of the bed. Finally, she looked at Stephanie's eyes. And then Laura started at what she saw. Stephanie's eyes were wide open. "Oh, honey, you scared me," said Laura as she replaced the chart and made her way closer to the patient. "How are you feeling?" "Huh?" Stephanie groaned. Poor girl couldn't focus, Laura thought. "I asked how you were feeling," she repeated kindly. Stephanie didn't respond. She only stared. "Let me get the doctor," Laura said as she backed away. That stare was starting to creep her out. Before she could turn around, however, Stephanie got up from the bed and started for the door. "No, honey, you have to stay here while I get the doctor." She tried to reach for the patient, but Stephanie smacked Laura across the room. A moment later, Laura slowly got to her feet and followed the crazed patient into the hallway. "Somebody stop her!" Laura called out, and the closest doctor said, "Not another one!" He ran towards Stephanie as a few nurses attempted to tackle the girl. Some of them were thrown about the hall. Even 5 grown men couldn't stop one small woman. Stephanie burst through the automatic doors of the hospital and ran off. Officer Fisher tried as best as he could to keep the crowd back, but they were insistent. They were also weird. It was early in the morning, and the people before him all had sleepy, blank faces, as if they'd just woken up. Almost everyone was in pajamas, except one guy. He was wearing a black hoodie and blue jeans. His long, curly brown hair was a mess, and there were dark tear tracks running down his cheeks. He was fiercely pale, and his face was the blankest of all, if that was possible. "All right, people," Patrick barked. "I'm giving you to the count of 3 to get back. 1, 2, 3. It was like a hypnotist had snapped his fingers to call his victims out of a trance. The crowd around Patrick shook their heads and looked around, dazed. A few of the people asked each other where they were. "Are you in need of assistance?" Patrick asked them, concerned. What he was witnessing was definitely not normal. The people declined his offer and walked away. They seemed to know where they were now. Others were astonished at the destruction of the garage, like they were just now seeing it. After Patrick repeated that they needed to get back, they did. Thankfully. All except one man, the one in the black hoodie with the dark streaks on his cheeks. Patrick wondered if it was an early Halloween costume, or if the man was sick. "Are you in need of assistance?" Patrick asked him. The guy, who looked vaguely familiar to the officer, stared at him for a moment, his head tilted to the side like a dog. He then looked at the destruction behind Patrick for a brief moment, and then turned sharply, as if he had just heard something. He was looking in the direction of Trident River, Patrick noted. Then he walked away, leaving Patrick more confused than ever. Moments later, someone came running up to him, waving her arms over her head. She looked to be in her early 40s, with tears running from her eyes.
"Please, you have to help me. It's my ma. Something's wrong with her."
The woman tugged on Patrick's arm. "It's okay, ma'am," he said gently. "Is your ma hurt?" She shook her head. "Okay, what's your name?" he asked her.
"Jessica."
"Okay, Jessica, take me to your ma." Patrick followed Jessica to a townhouse a block away. They passed a few people who still looked dazed, like they'd just awoken from a hypnotic state. Jessica's townhouse was on the ground floor, and as they ran down the hall, Patrick saw a few people stick their heads out of their doors. One man noticed Patrick's uniform and asked what was going on. "Everything's under control, sir," he replied as he continued to follow Jessica. At last they reached her mother's place. The door was closed, and Jessica retrieved a key from her pocket.
"I had to lock the door," she said cryptically. "She's tied up right now, but just in case. I didn't want anyone going in to check on her."
"Why not?" Patrick asked.
"Because I was afraid she'd hurt them."
Patrick was about to ask her to elaborate on that when both of them heard a crashing noise from inside. Jessica had just undone the lock when Patrick pushed the door open and drew his gun. The townhouse consisted of a bottom floor and a second floor. The staircase was right by the front door. As soon as he stepped in, Patrick noticed the living room was in shambles. It looked like a great deal of fighting had gone on. There were broken plates and vases. The stuffing had been ripped out of a tasteless orange sofa on the left side of the living room. The TV, on the right, had a hole in the screen. "What happened here?" Patrick asked Jessica. The woman shook her head as tears fell down her cheeks.
"This morning, we heard all this noise down the street. I moved here to take care of my ma because she was sick. When I went into her room to check on her, I saw she wasn't breathing. I was about to call an ambulance, but then there was this weird explosion. It made my ears hurt. And then, Ma jumped up out of bed. She tried to go outside all of a sudden, and I tried to stop her. She threw me around like a doll. She was so strong. I hit her on the head with a vase, and that stunned her for a minute. I tied her up."
That was a heck of a story, and Patrick found himself believing it completely. Worse yet, it reminded him of what he'd seen at Daniel Hudson's condo earlier. Patrick could have sworn he saw the dead boy blink just before being sealed up in the body bag. No one else had seen it, though, and the last thing Patrick wanted was to be considered crazy, unstable. Daniel's body hadn't moved at all during its trip to the medical examiner's van, which Patrick made sure of. He even tried to see the body one more time before they loaded it in, but there had been no time. He'd had to get to the garage. But now, here was this story of a mother who died just before the strange pulse that rocked the city, and then came back to life. Was it a coincidence? Had Jessica been mistaken about her mother having died in the first place? Maybe the old woman had just looked dead. None of those questions explained the state of the townhouse. Had Jessica really been thrown around like a rag doll? He studied the woman and saw she did look a tad beaten up. Her clothes were probably masking the majority of the damage. "Where's your mom?" Patrick asked her.
"In there."
Jessica looked straight ahead to a room just past a tiny kitchen. The door was closed. Patrick approached the door, placed his hand gently on the knob, and turned slowly. Inside the fairly large room, tied to a four-poster bed, was Ma. She was wearing a long blue dress. Jessica had tied her mother's arms and legs to the posts with tape, rope, and clotheslines. Patrick looked at Jessica, who was almost old enough to be his own mother. She was also more terrified than any adult he'd ever seen. Aside from being a cop, he felt a natural need to protect her, even if it was from her own mother. He lowered his weapon as he approached the bed. "What's her name?" he asked Jessica.
Ethel.
"Hello, Ethel," Patrick said gently to the old woman. She was staring at him with a blank expression. Dried blood stained her forehead. "I hear there was some trouble earlier this morning. Is everything okay?" Ethel said nothing. "Your daughter says you attacked her. Is that true?" No response. "I see you're hurt. We should get you to the hospital. Does that sound good to you?"
Huh?
Her first word, though it was barely a word, and it was barely audible. "I said we should get you to the hospital so the doctors can look at you."
Huh?
Was she asking Patrick what he was saying, or was she merely groaning? It sounded like the latter.
Huh?
It was more insistent this time, more of a grunt than a groan. Patrick backed away, pulling Jessica with him. Ethel tried to reach out to them with her left arm, but it caught short on the rope tying her to the post. She jerked her arm and the post snapped off the headboard. Patrick and Jessica ducked. The flying post almost struck them. "Back up," Patrick ordered Jessica, who complied. Ethel was breaking free from her bonds. Patrick pulled his gun again and pointed it toward the open bedroom door. After what felt like an eternity, the old woman appeared in the doorframe, looking like some kind of demon in the dim room. "Ethel," said Patrick, "I don't want to have to hurt you." He couldn't believe he was saying these words at all, let alone to an old woman. Ethel reminded him so much of his grandma, who was still very much alive herself. He wanted to call her at that moment and tell her he loved her. Ethel lunged for Patrick and Jessica. The two of them fell backward as Patrick pulled the trigger. The bullet shot into the ceiling, raining plaster onto their faces. Ethel was on top of Patrick a second later, trying to rip the gun from his hands.
Mom, stop it!
Jessica screamed from directly next to them. Ethel looked at her daughter with a blank expression for a moment.
Huh?
She moaned. Patrick just lay there, too afraid to move. Ethel held his wrist in steel grips, and he felt they would snap any second. How could she be this strong?
Jessica?
Ethel said quietly, her blank expression becoming a little less so. The woman's grips on Patrick's wrists decreased slightly, but she didn't let go completely. It was at that moment Patrick noticed Ethel seemed absolutely still, as if she wasn't breathing. She was as still as a statue on top of him. He thought of checking her pulse, even though she was clearly alive. The thought of it made him want to laugh, but he couldn't shake the feeling the woman on top of him wasn't breathing. Before he could make any move, Ethel collapsed on his chest. Patrick checked her pulse then. She had none. He doubted she'd had one at all during his time with her.